Imagine you're a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, and you've just been given the most disturbing task of your life. The pharaoh's wife lies in front of you on the marble table. But this isn't a regular mummification. You've been told to preserve her body in a way that breaks every sacred rule you've ever followed. And the reason chills you to the bone. This wasn't made up. This was normal life in ancient Egypt, where private acts were so extreme, they would shock people today. You think you understand Egyptian history. The shiny treasures, the powerful pharaohs, the strange pyramids. Here's what they never tell you in school. Ancient Egypt had sexual habits so intense that early archaeologists actually hid the proof, where royal children were forced to suffer terrible abuse by their own relatives, and where holy festivals turned into wild weeks of violence and sexual madness. What I'm about to show you will make you rethink everything you believed about one of history's greatest culture. Because the truth about Egyptian sexual customs is so disturbing that museums around the world tried to cover it up for over 100 years. Along the rich banks of the Nile, the Egyptians created customs that would shock even the most open-minded people today. This wasn't just about private pleasure or holy rituals. It was about cosmic power, divine control, and using sexuality as a tool for political power. The pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were living gods whose sexual actions were thought to directly affect the Nile's flooding, the food supply, and the survival of Egypt itself. This led to huge pressure to show divine power through more and more shocking acts. The proof comes from temple carvings that tourists never notice, papyrus writings about acts too graphic for museums, and archaeological finds that Victorian scholars secretly kept hidden from the public. When 1800s archaeologists first saw graphic images in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so shocked that they either destroyed the proof or hid it in private rooms. Egyptian culture was built on the idea that sexual energy was cosmic power. Every intimate act was possibly a holy ritual. Every orgasm, a message to the gods. Every sexual pose, a kind of prayer. This belief created a society where the line between worship and intimacy, between duty and pleasure, completely vanished. But this sacred sexuality also had a dark side. Children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just legal, but religiously necessary. And when things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The discovery that changed everything happened not in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the next century. The boy king's genitals were missing. Not damaged, not decayed, but surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death, as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone, as more royal mummies were examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques. A disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign material. The most shocking discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed not just missing genitals, but evidence that the removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this was not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts began to make disturbing sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, descriptions of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods, and instructions for modifying the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world. The implications were staggering. If the Egyptians were routinely modifying the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality and the human body? Were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? But perhaps most disturbing of all was the systematic way Victorian archaeologists had hidden this evidence. When early Egyptologists encountered explicit sexual imagery or evidence of genital modification, they didn't just ignore it, they actively suppressed it, removing artifacts from public view and editing descriptions out of official reports. For over a century, the true extent of Egyptian sexual practices has been concealed not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame and Victorian prudishness that couldn't accept what the evidence clearly showed. But the missing genitals were just the beginning of what archaeologists found. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the top were the pharaohs, whose sexual performance was considered vital to Egypt's survival. Below them, nobles and priests faced enormous pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion. At the bottom were domestic slaves, particularly children, who faced systematic abuse that was not just tolerated, but religiously mandated. Royal children born into this system faced a particularly horrific fate. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families would dedicate their youngest children to temple service, where they would be trained in sexual techniques from an early age. These children, some as young as 6 or 7, were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the gods. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Children learned specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during extended religious ceremonies. They were taught to dissociate from their own physical sensations, to view their bodies as instruments rather than personal property. Medical papyri describe the physical toll this training took on young bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from forced flexibility training. Their growth was often stunted by poor nutrition designed to maintain childlike proportions preferred by adult clients. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature intimate activity, but the abuse extended far beyond temple training. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children being particularly prized for their supposed purity and malleability. Legal documents show that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and training. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who lived to adulthood showed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. They had difficulty forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and frequently died young from what ancient texts euphemistically called broken hearts. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was justified through religious doctrine. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship, that children chosen for such service were blessed rather than victimized. Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the true nature of what would happen. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical analysis revealing procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to child slaves, funding a systematic industry of abuse that lasted for millennia. But if you think that's the worst thing Egyptian children faced, you're not ready for what's coming next. This systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most notorious religious festival. What I'm about to reveal involves practices so extreme that when early archaeologists discovered evidence, they literally burned the documents rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. The next practice combines religious worship with sexual violence, on a scale that would shock even modern audiences. It involved an entire civilization descending into week-long orgies of chaos, and the archaeological evidence proves it really happened exactly as the ancient sources describe. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next, and definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism, an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor that transformed the entire civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious chaos. What started as a celebration of divine femininity evolved into something that would be considered a crime against humanity by modern standards. The festival's origins lay in Egyptian mythology, specifically the story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to legend, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre to make Sekhmet think she was drinking blood, causing her to become so intoxicated that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This myth became the template for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a state of divine possession. But the festival went far beyond simple intoxication. Participants believed that in their drunken state, they became vessels for the gods themselves, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequence. The preparation began months in advance. Temple authorities would brew massive quantities of beer, often adding psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other plants. The resulting mixture didn't just intoxicate, it created hallucinations and dramatically lowered inhibition. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces. When the festival began, normal social rules completely disappeared. Masters had sex with slaves in public squares. Married women abandoned their families to join roving bands of revelers. Children were exposed to explicit intimate acts and often became participants themselves. The entire civilization descended into chaos that lasted for 7 days and nights. Ancient texts describe scenes that shock even modern readers. Groups of intoxicated Egyptians would storm through cities, breaking into homes and forcing inhabitants to join their celebrations. Women were subjected to group abuse that was considered religious communion. Men competed to see who could maintain sexual arousal for the longest periods, while completely intoxicated. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality. Participants would attack each other with sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were considered marks of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries caused by violent sexual acts. Others were trampled by crowds of intoxicated celebrants moving through narrow streets. The religious justification made everything even more disturbing. Priests taught that any act performed during the festival was by definition holy, since participants were possessed by divine spirits. Abuse became religious communion. Violence became sacred offering. Child abuse became divine blessing. Foreign visitors left accounts that reveal international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as proof that Egyptians were barbarians disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some kingdoms refused to send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their safety and moral contamination. The festival's aftermath was as traumatic as the event itself. Participants often had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. Families were destroyed when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival faced stigma as offspring of divine possession rather than normal conception. The economic impact was staggering. Entire cities would shut down for a week while the population engaged in drunken revelry. Agricultural work stopped, trade ceased, and government functions ground to a halt. The cost in lost productivity was enormous, but pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance. The festival also served political purposes. By providing a safety valve for social tensions, it allowed the Egyptian system to maintain rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could rebel against authority, Masters could be humiliated by slaves, and social norms could be violated. But only during this carefully controlled period of chaos. Archaeological evidence confirms the extreme nature of these festivals. Excavations of temple sites reveal specialized chambers designed for group sexual activities, with features that suggest they were used for violent and degrading acts. The physical evidence matches the disturbing accounts left by ancient writers. The systematic collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious practices. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. But their Greek sensibilities were horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. Cleopatra I attempted to modify the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration and imposing limits on the violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests argued that modifying the festival would anger the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They pointed to natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in sacred tradition. The crisis reached its peak during the reign of Cleopatra III, who faced the impossible task of satisfying both Egyptian religious expectations and Roman political demands. Roman observers were scandalized by Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as evidence of barbarism and moral decay. But Egyptian priests threatened rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was to create private versions of the festivals for Egyptian religious leaders, while presenting a more modest public face to Roman audiences. This compromise satisfied no one and created a culture of hypocrisy that undermined both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political control. The abuse of children became even more systematic during this period, as desperate rulers tried to prove their devotion to Egyptian traditions, while hiding the evidence from Roman oversight. Child slaves were trafficked in larger numbers, their abuse conducted in secret chambers that Roman officials were not allowed to enter. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was enormous. Generations of children had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure forced changes to these practices, many Egyptians experienced a form of cultural trauma. They had lost not just religious traditions, but their entire framework for understanding sexuality and divine relationships. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the suppression of sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and executed priests who refused to abandon traditional ceremony. But the Romans didn't just suppress Egyptian sexual practices, they systematically erased evidence of their existence. Temples were stripped of explicit decorations, papyri describing sexual rituals were burned. Even architectural features designed for religious sexuality were destroyed or hidden. The children who had been trapped in this system faced a particularly tragic fate. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned for sexual service that they couldn't adapt to normal life. Roman records describe former temple children who died by suicide rather than face a world where their only perceived value had been eliminated. The survivors carried trauma that affected Egyptian society for generations. The systematic sexual abuse had created patterns of behavior and belief that couldn't be easily erased by political conquest. Roman governors reported ongoing problems with underground sexual cults, child trafficking networks, and religious movements that tried to restore traditional practices in secret. But even the Romans couldn't destroy all the evidence. What they left behind would shock Victorian archaeologists into creating the greatest cover-up in archaeological history. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian moral sensibilities that couldn't handle the archaeological truth. When 19th-century explorers first encountered explicit sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they faced a cultural crisis that shaped Egyptology for the next century and a half. The pattern was established early. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered explicitly sexual wall paintings in the tomb of Seti I in 1817, He immediately ordered them covered with plaster rather than document. His published account described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes, while completely omitting the graphic sexual content that filled several chambers. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era. Augusta Mariette, the founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never displayed publicly. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, entire categories of artifacts were relegated to restricted storage areas that only male scholars could access. The suppression wasn't limited to imagery. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content out of ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases or simply omitting entire passages. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, had over 40 sections dealing with sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s. Perhaps most shocking was the systematic destruction of evidence. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted to destroying artifacts he considered too obscene for public consumption. His journals described burning papyri, smashing statues, and tearing artifacts that depicted sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document. The cover-up extended to academic institutions. Universities refused to fund research into Egyptian sexuality, considering it inappropriate for scholarly study. Students who showed interest in these topics were discouraged or expelled. Academic journals rejected papers that discussed sexual practices even when they were based on solid archaeological evidence. Museums developed elaborate systems for hiding sexual artifacts. The British Museum alone has over 2,800 suppressed Egyptian artifacts, stored in restricted access areas labeled only as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. As recently as 2019, the Louvre was caught hiding newly discovered papyri from public view. Even Wikipedia articles about these topics are mysteriously locked from editing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York maintains similar restrictions. Their Egyptian galleries display sanitized versions of tomb paintings with explicit sexual content either covered or digitally removed. The original artwork remains in storage, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic need and agree to strict confidentiality requirements. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus on political history, religious beliefs, and artistic achievements while completely ignoring the sexual practices that were central to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of ancient Egyptian life. This ongoing concealment has created massive gaps in public knowledge about human sexuality, religious practices, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The horrors hidden in Egyptian tombs and texts reveal how easily religious devotion can transform into systematic abuse when human sexuality becomes a tool of cosmic control. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization created and maintained practices that treated children as sexual property, normalized violence as religious worship, and used intimacy as a weapon of political domination. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.